so much for joining us today here on NewsX. So how might this free trade agreement between India and the European Union reshape trade dynamics, especially among major economies? Really sorry, we are just experiencing some difficulties. As we could probably imagine, there is a lot to talk about with this meeting ahead, and it should be over an hour away until we find out what is the agreement and how this is going to shape the two regions, the EU and India, into helping each other come together. As we can hopefully see, there will be some economic and political benefits between the two, and this agreement could influence India's broader foreign policy and partnerships. Okay, we are now being joined again by Jaijit in the newsroom. Thank you so much for joining us. How might this free trade agreement between India and the European Union reshape global trade dynamics, especially among major economies?
You know, as of 2026, the EU and India together is about 25% of the global economy and roughly 25% of the global population. By 2030, it will be one of the largest trading blocs in that sense, if we look at the free trade agreement being formed, and that's going to be quite transformational because the center of gravity will be shifting to this axis of EU and India. As we see that the world is splitting between the American economy and the non-American economy, and the EU-India trade agreement seems to be the fulcrum around which the non-American economy will start shaping up, given the size of the market and the size of the economy that these two economies present. From an Indian perspective, clearly some of the areas that was of interest was labor-intensive industries, besides the usual steel and aluminium and automobiles and machinery. And this agreement is believed to be friendly towards the labor-intensive industry that India has. Similarly, from the European perspective, they were very keen to get access to the Indian market in terms of automobiles and wine and spirit and so on and so forth, and the Indian market is massive for these producers. There will always obviously be some checks and balances that will be put into place to ensure that imports from China are not routed through this kind of a trade agreement. So those checks and balances will be put into place, but it will be hugely impactful for both EU and India. Some of the background constraints that we need to look at is what will be the non-tariff trade barriers that will be put into place, and if there are any non-trade noises that will be coming into the agreement, which is what's been holding back this agreement for over 2 decades. And these, relate to human rights and other non-trade related issues. We are pretty confident that those noises and those issues have been removed, and this is a pure trade agreement which is going to be significantly beneficial for both the economies.
And what economic and political benefits could this deal create for India and European business workers, and also what challenges could they face as well?
Clearly the benefit is the fact that EU is breaking away from its dependence on US, and same with India. As I mentioned, it's basically the restructuring of the geoeconomics and forming a non-American trade bloc, not by design, but it has happened because of the policy decisions by the US administration. And as an outcome, we see that what we could not sell in the US economy can be sold to the European economy, and the other way around, what EU could not sell to the US economy because of the unfair tariffs that have been put into place, EU can sell that to India. So clearly there is a reciprocal benefit that both are getting. From an Indian perspective, in addition, there is a mobility clause that has been put into place, which means that Indian professionals can also contribute to the workforce in Europe. And that's significant, and that's been a feature in most of the recent trade agreements that India has been putting in. Also, I believe that if it's if it has borrowed from the previous agreement that has been signed with Switzerland and Liechtenstein, then there will be an element of investment from the EU into India, and EU is already one of the largest investors into India, so that will give a fillip to the Indian economy, and that will also give access to the European Union into the Indian economy. So that's going to give a huge fillip to the European economy.
Thank you, Jaijit. Don't go anywhere, as we will come to you a bit later. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says that Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney walked back comments he made at Davos after a phone call with US President Donald Trump. Bessent added that Trump spoke directly with Carney, who aggressively reversed some of the remarks he made about the global rules-based order. Carney had urged nations to accept the end of the global order and said middle powers must act to avoid being on the menu. His remarks received a standing ovation in Davos. Trump responded by revoking Canada's invitation to his Board of Peace and threatened tariffs on Canadian goods if Ottawa moved forward with trade deals with China. Bessent added that Carney's move was crucial, calling Canada dependent on the US and warning that any additional tariffs would be disastrous. The Canadian Prime Minister had recently visited China to reset trade ties with Ottawa's second largest partner. We are now being joined back by Jaijit in the newsroom. Why do you think Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped back from his Davos remarks after speaking with Donald Trump?
I'm not entirely sure whether that's really what happened, because the credibility of the US administration officials have been come under scrutiny recently. We have seen that video proof of their view of what happened in Minnesota, where unarmed or peaceful protesters has been killed, has been the video proof has been contrary to what the US administration officials have been saying. And there have been multiple such instances where the credibility of what the US administration says has been a big question mark. So if did the Canadian Prime Minister really walk back or didn't walk back on his comments that he made in Davos is not something that we are really sure about. We know what he said in public, and those are very forceful comments. We also know that Canada has been challenged by the fact that suddenly all their supply chains which are geared toward the US has been disrupted because of the tariffs. We also know that the Canadians are pushing very forcefully into opening up their access to their coast, for example, for pushing out oil, and therefore they're finishing up the pipelines that connects them to their coast, which gives them access to the rest of the world. So they're realigning their supply chains away from the US, and I don't see why any short-term comments is going to be louder than what the Canadians are actually executing on the ground. And also the fact that what Carney said in Davos was said in a public forum for the consumption of public. If there was any reason why he walked back, that could possibly be because the US agreed to some of the terms and conditions that Canada has laid out. And also the fact of the matter that the US is probably seeing that the world is splitting between the American economy and the non-American economy, especially in the context of the fact that EU and India are getting into a free trade agreement, which is a huge a block that will be created where American products will probably not be able to get that access. And hence US has to mend its ways in terms of how it's treating its trading partners and allies, and Canada really is one of its very important trading partner and ally. So possibly the US administration would have walked back, which might have led to the Prime Minister of Canada also walking back if that actually happened.
And what does this situation tell us about how much influence the US still has over its allies, such as Canada?
there is an old adage that if you use power, you lose power. So the US has been extensively using its power, and as a result, its allies and its trading partners have been figuring out ways and means to shield themselves from the exertion of leverage and power that the US has been carrying out in the recent past. And yes, the US is still the largest economy in the world, and it does have very significant leverage on Canada, but so does Canada have on US. A lot of oil, especially in the northern part of US, comes from Canada. A significant part of uranium that is needed to power US comes from Canada. So a lot of energy dependence is on Canada. Similarly, there is a lot of food security dependence on Canada because they supply the fertilizers. They supply the raw materials that get into the fertilizers, which is very critical for the US agriculture. So there is leverage that Canada also has, and those leverages are very, very sharp and basic because it is about energy security, food security, and hence it comes to question whether US can actually continue to exert the kind of pressure it has been doing on Canada, or will there be a level playing field at some point in time?
Thank you